I'm going to animate the iconic Apple logo in 3 distinct styles using my favourite motion design tricks and a couple of techniques I have never tried before. The year was the late 90s. The design was slick and weird and alien, because what lay just across the horizon was a silver trousered future so close we could taste it on our frosted tips. An element I love from this era is the inexplicable floating liquid. Nothing more futuristic than that. I find the best way to animate organic motion like this in 2D is frame by frame. And what better way to test out Procreate Dreams? Now, one problem to address is that the logo is mostly round and blobby, but it's got these points. And unless we round them off completely, it's not going to look like a bubbly Y2K blob. But I have an idea. When bits of liquid separate, they sort of tear away from each other, stretching out and then bounce back into shape, squashing and stretching. And as they rip apart, the force pushes the liquid away from the tear and we get this arc shape. So I thought I could use that big tearing motion to snap the bite mark into the shape of the logo. I animated that motion about 3 times to get it right, animating on 4s, 6 frames per second to make sure the timing in the motion felt fluid before getting too lost in the detail. Then I headed into After Effects to clean up that animation. I traced over all of those frames on a single shape layer, keyframing the path every 4 frames to match. Then I went in between each of those and added an extra frame to make it smoother, making sure each Bezier handle was angled to create a smooth curve and it felt fluid. I used 3 total shapes in that one shape layer because it ends in 3 separate blobs, and them being on the one layer means that we can apply gradients more conveniently. I added some extra bouncy squash and stretches to the blobs and had them slow down as they float away. Now, I'm not sure if Newton and his frankly oppressive laws of motion would agree with that choice, but I didn't want the eyes to be drawn away from the logo at this blob, making it all about them as they jiggle distractingly towards the edge of frame. Now for the color. IMAX came in a great set of colors in 1998, and on this one ad I saw while researching, it flashed through all of the colors and had this light shining through the translucent logo and spilling onto the background, which I absolutely love. So this was the palette I was inspired by. Suitably Y2K, but achievable with 2D and After Effects. It was in terrible resolution though, so I felt it was my duty to recreate that effect as a matter of art restoration. For the background, I made pale grey stripes a bit subtler than those in the ad, with a gradient ramp and a darker layer with the Venetian blinds effect and a little bit of blur. Then I coloured the logo shape layer a teal colour and added the layer style in a glow, so that all of the edges had a nice gradient. Then I duplicated that layer for some darker shading on the bottom. I changed its colour, added a mask, feathered it for a nice gradient, and keyframed the very first few frames so they matched the changing shape of the blob at the start. Then I did the same on another duplicate for the top of this blob, this time even darker. On another duplicate of the blob, this time coloured white, I added an offset path to each shape so it was pushed in from the edges equally on all sides. Then again added a feathered mask and keyframed that to hug the edge of the top left throughout the animation. Same for the other large blob. For an extra highlight, I created a white solid with a circular mask, again feathered to get a gradient, but for a softer gradient that got more intense towards the centre, I duplicated the mask a few times, shrinking it and decreasing the feather amount, and keyframed its position to match the shine, repeating that for the bubbles too. For that reflection of light spilling onto the background, I first just duplicated the logo again, placed it underneath everything and set it to a lighter colour, and offset its position so it behaved kind of like a drop shadow. But it wasn't quite working how I'd like. Now, light was passing through our blob, but obviously not all of it, so it did need a bit of an actual shadow. So I duplicated that layer again and made a slightly darker grey drop shadow, and added a light blue shadow on top, and that felt much better. I added Apple's Think Different tagline, which doesn't sound ominous in any way, and the style was done. Fluid, glossy, and still optimistic about a future filled with all of this. Now, some of you may be expecting some more critical comments about Apple in this video, because a previous video of mine did take some shots at tech messiahs and their followers. But I honestly use a lot of Apple products. I find them useful, and that would just feel hypocritical. So I'm just not gonna pay any taxes. Apple's 1970s logo is my absolute favourite and probably their most distinct. It had a very basic animation back then.
Apple, the personal computer.
To recreate that, all we need to do is separate the sections and have them appear on one after another. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to get that rich analog feel graphics had back then, and reference some of the earliest motion graphics of the 70s created on the first motion graphics machines like the Scanimate. They were way more limited than what we have now, but they pushed those things to the limit, and the results are so much more captivating than a lot of the work we have today when we have unlimited options. They had constraints, and that's what we need to do to get that effect. Constrain ourselves. I started by animating the whole apple scaling down and moving slightly into position so it felt like it was moving in 3D space. Then offsetting each of the segments so it came together piece by piece. I added an expose effect to each segment that increased when they stop and then faded off so they each kind of light up. For some effects over the top, I added my favorites on an adjustment layer, deep glow, a curves effect to darken it back to the original colors, and some grain with noise HLS auto. Also a slight shake to emulate a kind of jittery VHS feel, with a transform effect and a wiggle expression on its position. But having something look like it's from the unthinkably distant past isn't just about the visual effects. Having the motion feel limited as well is just as important. An example that is both good and bad is the title sequence to Babylon Berlin, a great series and an almost perfect title sequence. It's set in the 1930s, so the graphics have a great Art Deco aesthetic. It's shaking all over the place, there's a great montage of footage, some in negative, and a very linear radial wipe over the text. Great contemporary imagery that sets the tone for the show. But then at the end, it scales up from the center and it's just so snappy and smooth, it just feels too modern to me. Like this could have only been done in the After Effects graph editor. One motion that to me just feels out of place. So let's make sure to avoid that. I also wanted to include their tagline underneath, so I needed to move the apple up to make room for it. Now normally we'd make a nice satisfying motion with easing, maybe some overshoot, certainly some anticipation, but no, we have to go linear. Just 2 position keyframes, no easing, let it snap clumsily into place, with an awkward pause for a few frames before and after. That's all. Leave it and walk away from the keyboard. Let's just fade on that text with 2 opacity keyframes, linear as the day they were born. But we can treat ourselves to a little bit of extra flavor by animating its fill color from red to white as it animates on. But still, this wasn't quite enough. I'd added those retro effects that I've added 1,000 times, but it needed something more. It needed something real. So I left my digital workspace and adventured out into the real world, coming home with this sweet cathode ray child, Philip. I got an RCA cable and an RCA to HDMI adapter, and now it works just like an extra monitor. Shout out to the wonderful Jack Harrison for his insights on getting this set up. But another important element we mustn't forget in these 70s graphics is the music. So I whipped up a little ditty to go along with this animation using my 1978 copy of Ableton, and it was done. Steve Jobs was a known space cadet, so let's stay in Wonderland and see how far down the lightning port goes. Psychedelic imagery is one of the most fun things you can animate. I've done a lot of it on this channel, but I wanted to find a way I hadn't tried before. I came across this style of stop motion called strata cut, pioneered by David Daniels. It involves sculpting clay or plasticine into blocks and cutting away sheets to reveal the cross section and taking a photo every slice. Now I didn't know just how far this could be pushed, even articulating mouths for lip sync and full body character animation, which you have to be so thoughtful about when sculpting the plasticine it seems almost impossible. But I didn't need to push it anywhere near that far, I just wanted some trippy colours and motion. So I got out some plasticine that I had left over from when I bought way too much for a single frame of this orange animation, and decided to do a smaller test to make sure it all worked. I mixed a few colours, creating little cone shapes that I stacked up, figuring that would look like a circle expanding once I had sliced it from the pointy end outwards, and then I wrapped and mushed them all together in a tube shape with some colour spiralling around the inside. I created a set with some paper on a curve, and for the base I popped a sheet of acrylic out of a cheap IKEA frame and placed that on top. Then I got to slicing. And here's how the first test went. It looked okay, it worked, but there was way less motion than I expected. So I knew I could go wilder with the mixing for the next one. A successful test though. Those cones of plasticine expanding were the most interesting part by far. and I learned that pieces going straight backwards barely had any animation at all. So I separated the rest into color groups, and these were really firm, so to soften them I got out my pasta maker, which I have for the sole purpose of conditioning clay, and then made smaller mixes of 2 or 3 colors together in various patterns and combined them all together into one colossus psychedelic sausage. The test sausage squashed really easily from the slicing, so I added some additional clay as support around the base and slapped that down on the chopping block. That was all the plasticine I had at my disposal, the last remaining in the country, so it had to work. I was really happy with this. There was much more motion than before, and the wild mix of colors looked great. The support helped, but really encasing it on all sides with clay would be ideal. I just didn't have the material for it. Now, due to the infuriating law of perspective, it got smaller as it went further away from the camera. So I made a new comp, scaling it up so it stayed the same size, then I added a rotation so there was even more motion. Now it was time to make it into the apple shape. I knew from the test that there was no way I could have sculpted that shape into the sausage and kept it consistent while slicing, so making it a circle and fixing it in post I figured was my best option. I decided to warp the circle using the effect Mesh Distort, so that it wouldn't just feel like a matte on top. This way the colors would flow around the edges and feel more natural. I did the same for the leaf using a duplicate of the circle comp. I added the Apple logo back on top of everything and set it to stencil alpha so it would cut out everything not directly underneath it. I also added a roughen edges effect to it and animated the edge to boil by adding an expression to the random seed. Now it blobbed around like plasticine would. It's not perfect, but it adds a little extra so it doesn't feel so clean and precise. For the background, I was torn. First, I tried to make it really psychedelic by stacking up versions of the circle with some inverted, and then adding a CC collider effect on top, and it did look cool. I liked that it was just totally overwhelming. You didn't know where to look and could barely make out the logo at some points, a truly heroic dose. But all those mirrored angles created sharp lines that made it look pretty digital, and I had poured way too much of my blood, sweat and plasticine into this to leave it looking like it was just made with a computer. So I tried something a bit more subtle. I duplicated the Apple comp, placed it in the background, scaled it up massively, blurred it all to heck, so now we have a soft gradient background. And then added a curves effect for some more contrast, and also reversed it so it spins the opposite way to our logo. And then to really spice it up, I duplicated that background layer again, set it to overlay to bring back more of the color, reduced the blur on that layer so we could still make out some of the shapes, and then added a CC radial fast blur to blur it out from the center outward so we have a more interesting blur, kind of like it's been warped with the lens. And this makes it look a bit like a liquid light show, which were very popular live projections on psychedelic performances in the 60s, using layers of oil, water, and inks. Something I would absolutely love to make one day, so please give me an excuse to do that. I added the Think Different text down there too, with the blending mode set to difference, so its color responded and inverted based on the background. I like that effect a lot, so I applied it to the logo too, and I like in particular that it made some of the colors a lot more weird and dark. Sometimes psychedelic art is just so hyper-saturated and bright and clean, it loses some of that organic, messy, playful, and occasionally dark appeal that makes it so interesting to me. I threw my looping subtle grit texture on top, and also some shake and grain from our 70s example, and I was really happy with this. I think I managed to make these all pretty distinct. Let me know which one is your favorite, and which one Steve would berate me for even considering. The project file for all 3 of these is yours to download for free in the description, and throughout this process we've been using motion design's most important facet, problem solving. Every step of the process is coming up against new problems and figuring out how to solve them with either design or animation. Here we used a lot of effects and style, also limiting and constraining our motion. And if you want to learn the most fundamental principles to tackle almost any brief, I have made 2 full-length animation courses, Motion Foundation and Master Motion Design. Together they're over 20 hours long, focused on practical projects and adding work to your portfolio, while arming you with those problem-solving skills to create both projects you want to make and projects that your clients will ask you to make. These are what I wish I had to help me on my journey to sort out what are the essential skills to learn and what are the most effective ways to use them, all while pushing yourself making fun animation. And if you buy them together, there's a $200 discount. There's a link in the description if you're interested, and thank you so much for watching.